So thank you, Mr. Greg Berg, for being with us today on ScoreKeeping by the Kenosha Opera Festival. Um, it's really exciting to be able to sit down with you and just ask a few questions. And just before we started rolling here, I had said, go easy on me. And the reason is because almost always the tables are reversed. In fact, this might be my first time actually interviewing a person. And you are a very practiced interviewer. Over at WGTD, you've got the morning show every morning.
And by the way, today, as we are recording this, is the 35th anniversary to the day of when I started at WGTD.
I didn't know.
I started on this date in 1986. And when I started there, I was mostly hosting classical music programs. Only very occasionally would I do an interview. And then it was really the early 1990s when I started to do interviews much more regularly. And I've been the full-time host of the morning show since 1997 or 1998. So,
wow, well,
yes,
congratulations. I had no idea. That's amazing. Well, actually, that segues really nicely into just my first question. You know, many people around Kenosha and Racine, this area, southeastern Wisconsin, will know you very, very well. You're extremely active here in all different corners of the arts, and particularly singing and opera and radio. But just for people that may not, for the wider audience, since this goes on YouTube and we serve even hopefully a wide audience, tell us a little about yourself and just give us a little bit of your background, some of your singing career. You had some very lofty notes with the Ryan Center in Chicago, but I'll leave the rest to you.
Okay, so I'm a kid from the Midwest. I was born in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and the son of a Lutheran pastor. So we moved from South Dakota to two small communities in Iowa, and then eventually my dad's last church was in rural Beloit, Wisconsin. So as far as where I've lived, I have lived between Beloit and Sioux Falls. So this is where I live. This is where I love to live too. And I was always interested in music. I was really quick at the piano. Started piano when I was 4. Picked up organ for church just a couple years after that, actually. I did love to sing as a youngster. I think one of the things where I'm really fortunate is that when my voice changed in high school, we happened to live in a small town in Iowa where there was an amazing voice teacher. And that was her hometown, and she'd moved back to Atlantic, Iowa to teach public school music and was my voice teacher. And she's the one who really unleashed my voice and really is the one who got me interested in opera. And so I had a very good teacher even in high school, and a very good teacher in college and in graduate school and so on. And my big claim to fame is I won the District Metropolitan Opera auditions, as did my first voice teacher. We won together, so that got headlines in the Omaha newspaper about teacher and student win the Met auditions. And not too long thereafter, I was privileged to, be in the Ryan Opera Center for the Lyric Opera of Chicago, one of 12, and they auditioned from all across the country. So it was really kind of the right place at the right time. They needed an understudy for the Count in Marriage of Figaro, and I was someone, that part was really, really good for me. So I was terribly green, but I really enjoyed my time with the Opera Center, 85, 86, and sang in the chorus for several operas, small little parts in several operas, and so I'm sharing the stage with Placido Domingo and some other notable singers and seeing the opera world up close. For as much as I enjoyed it and it was exciting, I kind of knew that life was not for me. I had interests that ranged far wider than that, and so I did not seriously pursue it. Took the radio job in Kenosha when it opened up in 1986, and then an opportunity came up at Carthage 5 years later, 1991, so I'm celebrating my 30th anniversary of teaching at Carthage, and have continued to do both of those things straight through. And my introduction to opera workshop at Carthage was helping Dr. Richard Sierdsma, long-time chair of the music department and long-time head of opera there. So I actually sang in a couple of productions for him, Johnny Skiki and one other, I think, and played piano for a number of his productions, including his last one, which was Strauss's Die Fledermaus, an abridged Die Fledermaus.
Oh, fun.
And he ended up performing the comic role of the jailer. And so that was his swan song. And then I have coordinated the opera workshop ever since. We've done a lot of different really fun things.
Yes, yes, you have. So one thing I wanted to ask about, actually, before we dive really deep into what's going on this summer, we just finished a collaboration, the festival, and Carthage, you were the music director for a different children's program. And actually, you have a very long history, as you sort of alluded to, of opera workshop at Carthage and, fostering an opera program there and bringing in a lot of kids who may otherwise not have known opera or not have had an entry point. I'm one of them. So tell us a little bit about that. Some of the titles you've done over the years. I know some of the pastiche things have become an interesting quirk of that particular program and what you do.
Yeah, one of the hardest things is, a lot depends on who you have. In terms of the students, opera workshop is not required of anybody to take. Even a vocal performance major does not ever have to take opera workshop if they don't choose to. So a lot depends on when students have the time and the inclination. And since I started there, of course, we've had the rise of musical theater.
Sure.
And so a lot of the students who otherwise would be in opera workshop, their first love is really musical theater, and so often we never see them or only very fleetingly see them in opera productions. So, but back before there was that, we were able to do things like the Magic Flute and the Marriage of Figaro and Elixir of Love and quite a few things over the years. And once in a while we've done what are called Pastiches, which is where you take a bunch of arias from a bunch of different things and try to meld them together into something kind of interesting. And sometimes that just makes more sense when the singers you have don't add up to a tidy cast for a given opera. And it's also a way to keep everybody really busy and engaged. And I have also, on a few occasions, actually composed brand new things. The very first time was when we found ourselves in a strange situation for J-term opera, where we had 8 women registered and 11 men.
Ooh.
And by that point we had done Gianni Schicchi and Il Tabarro, and I really wanted to do Su Angelica to finish out the Trinico, and we had great women to do that. But then what do I do with these 11 men? And even if we hadn't done Su Angelica, what do I do with these 11 men?
Sure.
And the honest truth was, it was the easiest solution was to compose a new opera. So we composed Black September with librettist Matt Baresi, and it was an amazing experience, which we don't have time to talk about today. And since then, I've written a couple of other original things, including the opera we'll talk about in just a little bit. I do want to say that for COVID, in the spring, when everything kind of stopped, one of the things I did was composed a modern retelling of Mozart's The Empresario, called The New Empresario, which we only did virtually via Zoom. It was pretty fun. And in the fall, so that would be the fall of 2020, with things where we were back on campus, but still very restricted, I was so anxious to do something where our singers could be unmasked. And so I came up with the concept of balcony scenes that we did in Siebert Chapel. And so things like the Gounod, Romeo and Juliet balcony scene. Juliet's up there, Romeo's down here, singing without masks in perfect safety. And for that, so we came up with 4 scenes that already existed that were either balcony scenes literally or could be done that way. And then I composed 4 balcony scenes that were brand new. And that really worked out pretty cool. I'm really proud of us coming up with a way to do a really vibrant, interesting opera performance, even during COVID, when so much of opera, as you well know, ground completely to a halt.
Oh, sure. And how cool to have somebody there that can create bespoke material, and the kids get to work with a living composer, which is another thing that's not always accessible to young singers, even through the early parts of their career, which is very cool.
And the other thing too, and I know you've had the experience of singing something brand new, absolutely brand new, and maybe still even being finished and polished, but in the case of things that are a little more modest in scope, such as I've composed, first of all, I'm writing them very much for those singers and for those abilities. And in many cases, these are my voice students, and I know their voices almost better than they do. Mm-hmm. And so I just have this sense of what's going to sound good in their voices and what's going to be good for them, what's going to be a challenge for them, and so on.
And show them off.
Right. So it's not just that the composer in question still has a pulse, but but also that in this case, it's also a composer who really knows those singers really, really well. I mean, even more so than Julie Stein knew Ethel Merman's voice. Mm-hmm. But I mean, he wasn't her voice teacher.
Sure.
So anyway, I'm not trying to equate myself with Julie Stein.
No.
But I mean that's I think an important piece of it, and it's also something where I was more than happy to make adjustments as necessary if I composed something that was just a little bit too high, or the phrases are a little too long, or whatever. But I also, I think, have a pretty good knack, and this is true for what I write for choir too. I have a good knack for writing things that are actually pretty simple, without, I hope, being simplistic.
Sure.
And that's really tricky, to write relatively simple music that's also interesting.
Actually, I have a great question just about that later on today.
All right.
It is hard to do. It's very hard to do. And
I mean, it's easy to write simple, boring music, to write simple, not boring music, to write simple music that you won't get really sick of, whether you're the singer or the listener. That's more of a challenge in a sense. And so anyway, so that's also, I think, worked out pretty nicely. That unlike probably the typical composer of brand new operas that are writing super sophisticated scores that are also incredibly difficult to learn, as you know, I'm just not that kind of composer, and I'm not capable of composing that kind of music, those kind of scores. Nor am I interested in composing those kind of scores.
Sure.
I mean, I write what I know how to write, and fortunately, it turns out to be pretty singable, pretty learnable. Mm-hmm. And when you're in the business of putting an opera together, that can be really important.
Oh yeah,
especially if time is not unlimited.
Right. Well, and with the rehearsal processes, there's almost never extra time. So that kind of an angle and a skill is a big deal. And also, it's you as a composer have your voice, and it's one of those things that I sometimes find, like when I was in school, I'm sure you've run across these types where young composers who are studying composition are trying to find their voice and what does that mean to them and what are they saying, and those are all completely valid questions. But one thing that I admire about your writing is that it seems to be just earnest, and it just sort of flows right out of you. In fact, one of my questions later, I won't jump the gun, but is about, I wonder sometimes if it just flows right out of your piano playing, you're able to improvise and all those sorts of things. And so the method sort of makes me, I've got great questions about that. I'm curious to know.
I'll let you ask that later.
Sure.
The short story I'll tell is a few years ago, Carthage was visited by Alice Parker. And Alice Parker was for many years the composer in residence of the Robert Shaw Chorale, the greatest professional choir probably in the world, or certainly in America. Yeah. And she came to Carthage. It was a thrill. And Kathy and I actually were assigned to take her out for supper one night. And it was actually Kathy who had the courage, because I didn't, to ask her, what's your advice for a young aspiring composer? And then she kind of tilted her head, meaning that I'm asking about this for my husband.
Sure.
And her response was so interesting. She said, most young composers try to write some wonderful piece of music that the whole universe will love and will make them famous. And she said, I think it is so much more valuable if you write for someone you know. That is, you write for a singer or singers that you know. And her advice was, go to the local high school and go to the choir director, introduce yourself and say, I would love to write something for your choir. Let me listen to your choir, and then I would love to write something for them. And if you like it, you can use it. You don't have to pay me. But and she said, that is the way for a composer to really find their own voice. And it's been her experience, and it's been my experience too, that the best things I write are when I have a very specific voice or voices in my head. And so I'm writing something that I think Nick Huff would sound wonderful singing, and where I can just hear Nick Huff's voice or Neil Sharnick's voice or Trevor Parker's voice or whoever it might be.
Sure.
And so I can't even explain why that works so well, but it really, really does. And so when I compose things for my church, I am imagining my church choir singing it, or the chamber singers at Carthage. I am imagining that particular group of voices, and I am writing something with them in mind.
Oh, cool.
And that is much, much more satisfying to me. And so everything I've written, in the opera realm has been the same thing, where I've written for really, really specific voices, and that's just unleashes something in the creative process for me.
How cool is that? That's great advice. Wow. What a fun story about getting to go to dinner with her and pick her brain a little bit.
Absolutely.
Birds of a Feather. It is your opera. You wrote it. You've done it once at Carthage, and I think, is that the only time so far?
Yes.
So it's been done once here in this community, and
I have to say, one of the things about composing an opera, and this goes for whether or not you're, some little person like Greg Berg or somebody famous like Jake Hagee or whatever, but you always wonder, will this ever get performed again?
Sure.
And the really sad reality is a lot of opera companies are extremely interested in world premieres.
Sure.
It is much less common for an opera company to be interested in presenting a work for its second production.
Right.
That's just the drop off of interest is pretty drastic, even for major composers. And so, and plus, in my case, like Black September, I'm quite certain nobody in the world is ever going to be interested in doing that, because the world is not clamoring for operas for a cast of 11 men.
Sure.
That's about as unpromising and impractical a cast as you could possibly have. But on the other hand, Birds of a Feather is something a little more bite-sized and kind of more normal in terms of what it demands, and so I'm thrilled that it has kind of a second lease on life.
Sure. Well, we're thrilled to have it. I mean, there are so many things about the piece that, if you're an opera lover, you can already latch on to, and things that you'll know and recognize, and things that the story is brand new, and even though there are some familiar things, there's a lot new about the piece. Do you want to just maybe say who are the characters, and what is the basic story? And you can just say as much or little as you like, but just give us a little background.
You bet. So this is, the full title actually is Birds of a Feather, a Magic Flute sequel. So this is conceived as a sequel to Mozart's The Magic Flute, one of his most famous operas. What I learned only after the fact, I, in my audacity, thought I was probably the first person who'd ever composed a sequel to The Magic Flute. And it's an idea I'd played with even years earlier, as you well know, because you were, I think, still at Carthage at the time that I was first playing around with some ideas. But anyway, I came to find out that within a decade of Mozart's death, there had already been a sequel to The Magic Flute composed.
Oh, really?
Yes. So there's actually a long history. I haven't explored that extensively, so I don't know anything about any of those sequels. But and obviously it was after Mozart's death, so it's things he had nothing to do with. But yes, people have had the notion of what happens to these characters. So in this case, it is the fun-loving Papageno, the bird catcher, and his sweetheart Papagena, whom he finally gets together with at the very end of that opera. And it is two of their children. And for those who remember The Magic Flute, when Papageno and Papagena finally get together, they sing this delightful duet that I sang for contest in high school. So I go back 1,000 years with this wonderful pa-pa-pa-pa-pa duet. And they sing about, we'll have a papageno, and then papageno, and then we'll have a papagena, and a papageno and a papagena, and back and forth. And they're imagining this life with all these kids. And so in this scenario, it is papageno and papagena, and the youngest of their children. So I think I have the narrator singing about 15 girls and 15 boys. Oh, the craziness and the noise, or something. But these are the last. Everyone else has left the nest. And the story is about how the boy and the girl are not happy in the roles that their parents have envisioned for them. The Papageno is a vigorous, energetic character, and often he's played by a really athletic baritone. So I kind of played with that and thought, what if Papageno then is really anxious for all of his boys to be athletes just like him? And so there's all this running and weightlifting and all this stuff, and this boy just does not like that at all. And likewise, Papagena, who's usually a very soubrette, very feminine kind of character, I envisioned her loving housework and dusting and making everything sparkle, and that's what she wants all of her girls to love as well. But this last girl does not. She just hates that, and she looks across and sees what her brother is doing and envies him so much, and likewise he envies what she gets to do. And so it's basically a story about identity and a little bit about gender stereotypes and the assumptions that we make, that all boys like to play with trucks and all girls like to play with dolls. And the fifth character is something of a narrator, kind of a mysterious figure who is present and observing, and ultimately plays a little bit of a direct role in kind of bringing everybody to a happy ending. And I envision this character as maybe the speaker in the Magic Flute, who's kind of a mysterious figure in and of themselves. Anyway, that's kind of an interesting characteristic. And the score is sprinkled with little references to the Magic Flute, to Mozart's music, little melodic references here and there. I've lost track, but there's probably 5 or 6 explicit things, and I don't know, do you call those Easter eggs when things are buried that somebody who knows the opera will probably recognize?
Oh, it's fantastic. And I think it's a really cool message. It's a really nice thing for kids and families, to hear. And in a way, one thing that struck me about it as I was watching the first time, I love that in a way it's kind of like a musical generational thing. It's like we're taking the previous era of music and all the good things about it that we can affirm and love and enjoy, and you were writing something of the time that we're in, and it's part of that heritage, but it's new too, and it has a message that's not necessarily something we see a lot in opera, just because it's such an old art form, and it's really a wonderful addition.
Right. I mean, and you're right about opera, that typically opera is very much built on a lot of very stale stereotypes about men and women and so on. And so this is not intended, or I don't presume for this to be a particularly sophisticated examination of what can really be a very difficult issue or question. But it's meant in a fairly lighthearted way to kind of open us up to kind of think about some of these assumptions that we make.
It's wonderful. No, I love it, and I think audiences are going to love it. And it really is charming. It doesn't feel like, it doesn't feel like, sit down and let's talk about this. It's really,
yeah, right.
It really brings it on in a subtle and I think skillful way, and in a way that people can enjoy and they can identify with the characters, and children will be able to identify with the characters. The whole family will sort of, I think, be able to smile and nod as they're sort of enjoying this thing.
I have to say, one of the best compliments I received from a a close friend. So, I mean, in a sense, I when a close friend gives you a compliment in a way you believe it, in a way you take it with a grain of salt because they're a good friend. But this really good friend came to the dress rehearsal because they couldn't see the performance, and I will always appreciate what she said, because I said something to her about how I had not intended to write this as a children's opera, an opera for children to watch, but it kind of became that,
Sure.
and which was kind of exciting because it was very much unintended. Yeah, but she said, absolutely, children should see this, but parents should see this too, because this is such an important lesson for parents. And honestly, that had never really occurred to me. I mean, not only had I not intended to write an opera for children to enjoy, but I hadn't thought about an opera for parents to enjoy. I mean, I'm not a parent myself. I just wanted to write a fun, meaningful opera for these 5 students. And I guess I haven't mentioned yet, but it's actually dedicated to the memory of a Carthage student who was tragically killed just a few weeks before we began rehearsals, and while I was still contemplating what to compose. And Ray Watson had been a participant in the opera workshop back when they were Rachel Watson. And so this was dedicated to Ray's memory, not because it was any reflection of their experience, but just because knowing that Ray had been through something uncommon and difficult in terms of gender and identification and so on, it just felt right to remember Ray by dedicating this to their memory.
That's wonderful. That is absolutely wonderful.
So, we've talked about the opera a little bit now. Let's turn to the actual composing of it. I was saying earlier that I had a couple good questions, and one thing that always strikes me about your music, in really any context, but especially opera, whenever you write opera, is that, whatever's going on with the melody, and in this case, these are very accessible, tuneful melodies that a lot of people will just enjoy as melodies. They're not necessarily simple, but they're not overwrought like some operatic melodies can be. But what's going on musically is still actually very, very complicated. In your music, there's a lot of lush, modal, interesting, moving, really dynamic harmony. So tell me a little bit about that, why you gravitate towards that device, and sort of, what are some of the tricks that you're pulling out of your hat harmonically? Because they're very interesting. When people hear the music, they'll, I think, be taken by how, for something that kids and families can get into, there's actually a lot of complexity there if you know music.
Yeah, that's a very astute observation, and I agree with, in terms of what I'm trying to do, and I hope I'm as successful as you are saying I am. I think the matter of keeping the melodies relatively simple, in my mind, has a lot to do with wanting the text to be clean and clear. And I think that's a real failing, frankly, of a lot of modern opera, is that it is so hard to understand. And of course, that's not limited to new operas. I mean, a lot of opera is, even if you understand the language in which it's been written, that doesn't mean that you can really easily understand the words, because clarity of the lyrics is typically not a high priority of opera composers. They're just trying to write gorgeous melodies in which voices will sound their most gorgeous, and then the assumption just is that hearing every word doesn't really matter that much. But when it's a brand new opera and it's a story you care about, and especially when it's your words, but also when it's the words of a friend like Matt Baresi who's written them, you want those words understood.
Sure.
And so that's why I try to keep the melodies of such a character that the text really can be pretty easily understood and just taken in. I mean, just because you understand the words, like you can make out the words, that doesn't necessarily mean you can sort of string them all together as you're hearing it and understand what was that sentence, or what is that character saying or expressing. So keeping the melody relatively simple pays important expressive dividends. But then you're quite right. something needs to be interesting. I mean, hopefully the melodies still are interesting, even if they're simple. But so then I try to delve into a careful, cautious use of dissonance to make sort of the musical whole a little more interesting, and in particular, trying to maybe create moments of kind of a dramatic surprise when the text takes you into something that is kind of suddenly an interruption or whatever it might be. The other thing is, I think it's not just the character of the melodies, but the harmonies too, where it can feel like this music belongs to this character, that nobody else in the opera, no other character would sing this music. This music belongs to them. And that, of course, goes all the way back to Mozart. He was one of the first composers to really work in that way. And so I guess that's what I'm aiming to do.
Sure, that's wonderful. I mean, it's a cool thing to see because, you know, there are as many types of composition as there are probably people. And yours is really lush and beautiful, and it really, I think, carries people along with it. And I think it suits opera really well. It's a very nice aesthetic.
Well, I'm glad you think so. And I guess the in a sense, the short answer is I'm not afraid to write, you know, beautiful music, conventionally beautiful music. I think there are plenty of composers who are really in the business of writing something that is startlingly new, and really are anxious to be saying something that is so fresh that you can't imagine it being composed before this moment. And that's just not where I am as a composer. So I would never say that anything I've ever written has been adventurous to that extent. I'm comfortable with the voice that I have as a composer, and that's just the way it is.
Well, that's how we like it anyway. So I just want to thank you for coming and talking to us today, Mr. Greg Berg, about your new opera, or relatively new opera, that we'll do this summer, Birds of a Feather, a sequel to Mozart's The Magic Flute. Do I have that fully correct?
That's absolutely the title. Yes.
Love it. And so we want to thank you for coming and sharing with us and telling us about yourself and everything. This has been a lot of good fun, and I've of course known you for a long time, but I'm excited for the audience to get to know you and to get to brag about you a little bit and about your piece. And we're very excited to have it this summer, and thanks for bringing it to the festival, and thanks for coming today.
Well, thank you for inviting me today, and thanks for including Birds of the Feather in your first Kenosha Opera Festival season. I'm pleased and honored.
Thank you. It's going to be great. I think everybody out there will love it.